Right now, in the middle of Siberia, armed police are cordoning off villages and using military jamming equipment to burn healthy camels alive in giant trenches. And the reason why might just crash the global meat market.
I know, it genuinely reads like the inciting incident of some crazy geopolitical thriller.
It really does. But, according to the intelligence assessments and the on-the-ground reporting we're analyzing today, this is a documented reality.
Exactly. I mean, the official narrative coming out of the region claims this is just a highly localized, routine veterinary response to a standard bacterial infection.
Right.
But the physical actions captured in these reports, like the massive deployment of state force and actual military technology, they point toward an aggressive cover-up engineered to protect a multi-billion-dollar export empire.
And that is the exact mission of this deep dive. We're looking at a huge stack of incredibly detailed reports, supply chain data, and epidemiological warnings to untangle this massive systemic macroeconomic risk.
A risk that is currently, camouflaged as a local farming crisis.
Yeah, exactly. So for you, the listener, I want to be clear. This isn't just some niche story about Siberian agriculture. This is about revealing a massive blind spot in the global supply chain. We want you to understand why the food systems you rely on every single day might literally be operating on a foundation of state-sponsored disinformation.
Yeah, to really grasp the magnitude of the systemic risk we're talking about, we first have to look at the severe biological contradictions in the official story.
Let's do it.
So the baseline claim from the government, this is in March 2026, is that they are actively managing localized outbreaks of pasteurellosis and rabies across the Siberian and Ural regions.
Okay, let me push back on that immediately because the epidemiological footprint here makes absolutely zero sense.
Right. It really doesn't.
If a state veterinary service is dealing with pasteurellosis, which, by the way, is a bacterial pneumonia, they rely on targeted interventions. They identify the sick herds, administer targeted antibiotics, and monitor the spread.
They don't panic.
Exactly. But the reports we have detail authorities enforcing a 5-kilometer stamping out radius.
Yeah.
That is a total kill zone. They are systematically wiping out every single cloven-hoofed animal within that massive perimeter.
It's wild.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. If my dog gets a bacterial infection, the vet gives him antibiotics, right? They don't nuke the entire neighborhood. Why are they using a sledgehammer for a mosquito?
That's the perfect way to phrase it. And what's fascinating here is that the disproportionate nature of it is exactly what flagged this for international monitors.
Because it's just so obvious.
Right. The physical response on the ground is biologically incompatible with a bacterial pneumonia outbreak. And the reports highlight one highly specific, devastating detail that completely unravels the official government line.
Oh, this is the part that really got me.
Yeah. It involves a farmer named Svetlana Panina. According to the documentation, state authorities entered her property and destroyed 40 cows, 150 sheep, 7 goats, and 3 camels.
Wait, the camels are the total anomaly in the data set here. Because while camels might have, some baseline vulnerabilities, they are not the primary urgent vector for pasteurellosis that would justify immediate untested slaughter.
No, not at all.
However, they are highly susceptible carriers for foot and mouth disease, or FMD.
Which is a highly volatile, airborne viral pathogen. It's incredibly contagious.
And the methodology of the slaughter is a critical tell here, right?
Yes. The reports state that these authorities are destroying the animals with 0 laboratory testing. No blood panels drawn, no milk samples taken to isolate the bacteria, nothing.
It's just going straight to the kill.
Yeah, they are executing immediate on-site incineration in massive, freshly dug trenches.
And if we look at the World Organization for Animal Health, the WOH, that exact physical sequence isn't random.
Not at all.
A massive multi-kilometer culling radius, coupled with immediate on-site trench incineration. That is the explicit mandated protocol for containing a foot and mouth disease outbreak.
Right. Because the FMD virus is so contagious, it can literally travel on the wind from unburned carcasses. So the tension here is incredibly high. The state claims they are fighting a localized bacterial infection, but the physical reality dictates they are desperately fighting an airborne viral pathogen.
They're essentially fighting the air itself.
Exactly. The physical actions perfectly mirror a desperate, undocumented war against FMD. But, physical actions in remote regions can be obfuscated.
Sure, they can hide trenches in Siberia.
Right. Where a state-level cover-up usually falls apart is in the macroeconomic data. You simply cannot hide the massive, sudden reallocation of government funds required to fight a pathogen of this scale.
Right, because if they are lying about the biology, the financial paper trail should expose the true mechanics of their response.
Yes, and if we look at the state procurement data from February and March of 2026, the numbers are just staggering.
I mean, they uncover secretly rushed state procurements for 13.6 million doses of FMD vaccine.
Yeah, amounting to an expenditure of over 408 million rubles. And this was authorized completely outside the standard cyclical procurement windows.
Just a sudden, massive purchase out of nowhere.
Exactly. And the logistical distribution of those vaccines is the most damning data point of all. Out of that emergency procurement, 350,000 doses were shipped directly to Novosibirsk.
Which just happens to be the exact geographic epicenter where the state officially claims they are only dealing with a routine pneumonia outbreak.
What a coincidence, right?
It completely betrays their internal threat assessment. This is like a city claiming they only have a minor plumbing leak, but we look at their credit card statements and they just bought 1 million sandbags and life rafts.
That's a great analogy. The financial footprint proves the internal panic.
But wait, couldn't an apologist argue this was just an aggressive, albeit poorly timed, prophylactic restocking of their veterinary reserves?
I mean, they could try, but the epidemiological timeline destroys that argument completely.
That's so.
To understand why, we have to look at the mechanics of viral strains. Traditional stockpiled vaccines in this region are formulated to cover standard Eurasian strains of foot and mouth disease. The local herds have a baseline level of managed immunity to the viruses they historically encounter. But earlier in the year, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization issued an urgent intelligence warning.
Right, about the spillover.
Yes. They tracked a highly probable spillover event of the African SAT1 strain of FMD moving outward from Azerbaijan.
So we are talking about an exotic African strain entering a geographically isolated Eurasian herd.
Exactly.
The existing immune shield of those animals is practically useless then.
Yeah.
The SAT1 strain is essentially a novel biological key, and the Eurasian herd has absolutely no locks to defend against it.
That's exactly it. The standard vaccines they had on hand provided zero cross-protection. The national herd was suddenly and completely defenseless against a highly volatile airborne exotic.
And this is where the paper trail gets even crazier.
Oh, yeah. If you cross-reference the procurement data with intellectual property filings, the panic becomes undeniable.
Right.
On March 17th, 2026, right in the middle of this supposed pneumonia crisis, a Russian Federal Research Institute suddenly filed and expedited a patent for a brand new vaccine targeting yet another exotic African strain, SAT2.
Okay, let's just step back and look at the timeline here, because the cognitive dissonance is incredible.
It really is.
In the exact same month that state authorities are using military-style cordons to burn camels in trenches under the guise of pneumonia, the state's own scientific apparatus is rushing patents for African strains of foot and mouth disease.
Yep.
And their financial sector is quietly buying up millions of doses of FMD countermeasures.
Yeah.
The cover-up is mathematically obvious at this point.
It's undeniable.
So what does this all mean? That brings us to the core systemic question, why? Why execute this elaborate, illegal, and intensely expensive deception?
It's a great question.
I mean, if the herd is infected, why not just declare the outbreak, utilize international WAH support, and manage the prices transparently?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's because in the modern global economy, transparency regarding biological threats carries an immediate, devastating macroeconomic penalty.
The penalty is just too high.
Exactly. The pathogen itself is no longer the primary threat to the sovereign state. The diagnosis is the threat.
Wow. The diagnosis is the threat.
We have to look at the baseline economic targets. In May 2025, just a year prior to these outbreaks, the country triumphantly secured official WOAH status as an FMD-free zone where vaccination is not practiced.
Right. And that specific certification is the absolute prerequisite for international trade access.
It's the golden ticket.
The political leadership has publicly anchored their economic strategy on a stated goal of boosting agricultural exports by 50% by the year 2030. You mathematically cannot hit those export targets without maintaining that FMD-free certification.
You are entirely locked out of the premium global markets without it. And there's a massive ticking regulatory clock forcing their hand, driven entirely by China.
Yeah, let's talk about China's role here.
On June 1st, 2026, China implements what is known as GACC Order 280.
Right, and we need to unpack the mechanics of Order 280 because it changes the entire architecture of global trade. This isn't just some routine bureaucratic update.
No, not at all. It institutes a policy of dynamic, zero-tolerance risk management.
The mechanism is brutal in its efficiency. Global trade operates on interconnected data systems, right?
Exactly. The World Organization for Animal Health maintains the WAHIS database, where member states are supposed to transparently report outbreaks, and China operates its own customs database called CIPHER.
Okay.
Under Order 280, these systems are essentially linked by algorithms that remove human diplomatic negotiation completely from the equation.
So if a sovereign state honestly reports a single isolated case of FMD into the international WAHIS system, the Chinese Cipher database algorithms detect that data point and instantaneously automatically suspend all meat imports from that nation.
Instantly. There is no grace period.
There is no contextual analysis.
Yeah.
It is an algorithmic guillotine on a multi-billion-dollar export pipeline.
And the cascade effect is immediate. The Middle Eastern markets, specifically countries like the UAE, where this exporter has been aggressively expanding their halal meat presence, they utilize similar dynamic risk frameworks.
So an honest WA Sharios report triggers an instant cascading embargo across the globe.
Exactly.
If you're listening to this and wondering how a regulatory database conflict in Eurasia impacts you, this is the exact mechanism that dictates global food inflation.
Yep, it affects everyone.
When a massive sovereign exporter is algorithmically locked out of the global market overnight, the remaining supply of agricultural goods is violently squeezed. Your grocery bill spikes because the entire global supply chain has to instantly reroute to cover the massive deficit.
And the state we are looking at knows this. They know that the cost of biological transparency is immediate macroeconomic quarantine.
Which exposes a fundamental systemic flaw in the international trade architecture.
It really does. The frameworks designed by the UN and the WAH are intended to protect global health through transparency.
Right, that's the goal.
But by attaching absolute instant economic destruction to the act of reporting, the system inadvertently incentivizes sovereign states to lie.
It's totally counterproductive.
From a purely cold macroeconomic perspective, the state calculated that funding a brutal domestic cover-up was cheaper than algorithmic excommunication from the global market.
And the term brutal is not an exaggeration. Here's where it gets really interesting. To maintain this international illusion, to keep the CIPHER database algorithms happy, the reports indicate the state is willingly sacrificing its own rural population.
Yeah, this is the darkest part of the reports.
They're constructing a biological firewall, and the bricks they are using are independent farmers.
This is where we analyze the domestic costs of systemic risk. The agricultural landscape in Siberia and the Urals is heavily consolidated. You have these massive corporate megafarms conglomerates like Miratorg and Sabagro.
The scale of these facilities is staggering.
Yeah, some house up to 120,000 head of cattle in a single concentrated location.
120,000 cattle in one complex. I mean, the viral load potential of a high-density facility like that is catastrophic.
Absolutely.
If the airborne FMB pathogen breaches the perimeter of one of those megafarms, international protocols don't allow for isolation. The entire 120,000 head herd must be culled.
The financial losses would be measured in the billions, completely aside from the loss of international export status.
So according to the source material, what was the government's strategic response?
They decided to utilize the small, independent farming communities surrounding these corporate hubs as a physical firebreak.
Wow. They are executing a scorched earth policy.
Literally.
Authorities are moving through these rural independent sectors and violently wiping out the livestock, the primary economic engine of these citizens, just to create a dead zone that the virus cannot cross.
Yeah.
They aren't just managing a crisis, they are actively choosing market winners and losers, treating the small farmer as a disposable buffer to protect the corporate monopolies.
And the economic metrics of this forced cull are revealing, too. The state is offering these farmers compensation at a rate of 171 rubles per kilo of live weight.
While the actual market rate hovers around 300 rubles.
Exactly. It isn't just an insult. From an economic perspective, that massive disparity indicates a state that is either severely lacking the liquidity to fairly compensate its citizens during a crisis,
or one that is simply leveraging its monopoly on violence to execute the cull as cheaply as possible.
right. Entire multi-generational livelihoods built entirely on small-scale milk and meat production are being zeroed out in a single afternoon.
But we live in an era of ubiquitous connectivity. You
Mhm.
can't just quietly burn thousands of animals in the smartphone era.
You'd think so, right? But when these farmers attempted to document the destruction of their property, the state's response escalated from veterinary overreach to what independent observers in the reports categorize as domestic agricultural terrorism.
This is the part of the analysis that completely shatters the illusion of a simple health crisis. The reports detail the verified deployment of military electronic warfare EW equipment into these rural farming zones.
It's unprecedented.
We have to explain how crazy this is.
Yeah.
Military EW is designed to disrupt enemy communications on a battlefield. Here, it is being used to blanket rural cellular towers with spectrum jamming, intentionally preventing local data packets from reaching the wider internet.
Just try to imagine the physical reality of that scenario. You are an independent farmer. Unidentified or heavily armed state police arrive, bypass all testing protocols, and begin slaughtering your healthy livestock.
Your immediate instinct is to pull out your phone, capture video evidence, and live stream the violation.
But you have zero signal. The military apparatus of your own country is actively suppressing your uplink frequencies to ensure that no video evidence triggers a violation in a Chinese customs database.
They are deploying the tools of modern warfare against their own civilian population to keep a piece of paper, a WAH export certificate, valid.
And the suppression tactics go far beyond just signal jamming. The reports document the arrest of an 80-year-old woman, the only pharmacist in her village, simply for protesting the culls.
An 80-year-old woman.
Yeah. And remember Svetlana Panina, the farmer whose camels were destroyed?
Right, the camel anomaly.
When she attempted to confront the regional minister of agriculture for an explanation, the official literally fled from her down a corridor.
Wow.
And shortly after that confrontation, Panina was detained, and authorities hit her husband with fabricated criminal charges for arson.
Arson?
Yes, claiming he was attempting to burn the very trenches the state had dug to incinerate his animal.
That is just, it is a systematic dismantling of the local social fabric. But this brings us to the ultimate strategic question. From a coldly pragmatic standpoint, did this draconian strategy actually achieve its goal?
Right. Did it work?
Did the suppression, the jamming, and the slaughter successfully shield their international export pipelines?
According to the intelligence data, absolutely not.
Because while you might be able to jam a local cell tower, you cannot jam the global intelligence apparatus. Information in a highly connected supply chain leaks far faster than any biological virus.
That is so true.
It's like trying to hide a kitchen fire from your roommate, but smoke is pouring under the door. You might stop the immediate localized leak, but the massive anomaly in the network traffic is already entirely visible.
You can issue press releases saying everything is fine, but the market reacts to the anomaly, not the press release.
And the first international partner to react to the anomaly was Kazakhstan. This is a crucial geopolitical pivot because Kazakhstan is Russia's closest ally within the Eurasian Economic Union.
Right. They share a massive, highly porous border directly adjacent to the Siberian and Ural regions where these culls are taking place.
And Kazakhstan clearly did not buy the official bacterial pneumonia narrative. Kazakhstan isn't waiting for the official fire alarm to go off.
No, they aren't waiting for the WOAH database to update either. They operate their own sovereign veterinary intelligence networks, and they rely on their own data.
Precisely. Based on their internal intelligence assessments, Kazakhstan unilaterally slammed their borders shut.
Yes, on February 24th, and then again with intensified restrictions on March 19th, they demanded strict, mandatory cargo inspections.
They instituted absolute decontamination protocols for all cross-border transport and completely halted the importation of live animals and meat products from a massive swath of Russian territory.
You have to ask why a close geopolitical ally would risk a diplomatic incident over this.
It comes down to macroeconomic self-interest, right?
Exactly. Kazakhstan has its own aggressive 2026 to 2030 meat export strategy. They are actively competing to expand their own footprint in the Chinese and UAE markets.
There is absolutely no strategic scenario where Kazakhstan will risk infecting its own national herd and subsequently losing its own ciphered database access just to help a neighboring state maintain a cover-up.
Their own macroeconomic survival dictates their border policy, completely overriding geopolitical alliances. And the domino effect was swift. Shortly after Kazakhstan restricted access, Belarus utilized similar intelligence to quietly implement its own import restrictions.
So if we look at the total systemic outcome, it is a staggering strategic failure. The state essentially burned its own domestic agricultural sector to the ground, deployed military assets against its citizens, and destroyed rural economies to protect their corporate megafarms' export status.
But those exports are crashing anyway.
Right.
Because in the modern trade environment, international partners trust their own localized intelligence gathering far more than they trust official, stamped self-reports from international bodies like the WOH.
It forces a massive paradigm shift in how we analyze global trade and systemic risk.
It really does. The old framework operated on a simple assumption: animal diseases are biological problems managed locally by veterinarians and reported honestly to international bodies for the collective good.
That was the ideal.
Right, but the new reality exposed by these reports is fundamentally different. In a hyper-regulated, algorithmically enforced global economy, a biological pathogen is no longer just a health crisis. It is a sovereign macroeconomic threat.
The actual biology of the virus is almost secondary to the economic devastation triggered by the algorithmic diagnosis.
Exactly. And the international certification systems, the very WOH and CIPHER frameworks designed to protect the consumer and ensure the safety of the global food supply, actually create a massive structural incentive for state-sponsored disinformation.
Because the punishment for truth is too severe.
When the systemic penalty for biological transparency is instant economic ruin, sovereign states will logically choose to lie. They will falsify epidemiological data, they will deploy military electronic warfare to enforce the silence, and they will sacrifice their own citizens to maintain the illusion of compliance.
The old rules of trusting global trade certificates at face value simply do not apply to this new architecture.
They really don't.
And that leaves us with a deeply unsettling reality to consider. Think about the sheer scale of the mechanics we just unpacked. If a major global power can deploy military spectrum jamming to silence rural farmers, fabricate criminal charges against its own citizens, and successfully hide a massive, highly contagious viral outbreak from international monitoring bodies, all just to keep the meat flowing into foreign markets.
Yeah.
How much blind trust can you actually place in the integrity of ANY global supply chain?
The terrifying thought.
The next time you are standing in a supermarket looking at a product with a certified safe stamp from a foreign market, you have to ask yourself, what exactly did a sovereign government have to cover up, or who did they have to silence just to put that stamp on your food?